Hello and welcome to this crash course on setting up a Rails development environment on Docker. I will walk you through setting up a Rails development environment along with its dependencies and database. We will install the gems on a separate volume, and we will use Docker bind mounts to map the source code on your local machine to the Docker container. This will support hot code reloading for Rails, along with bybug and pry for debugging. As always, the scripts used in this video will be linked below along with the blog post with step-by-step instructions. So without further ado, let's get started. The Rails application we'll be Dockerizing for this video is restaurant.com. So before I get started, I'm just going to test out the app and make sure everything is working. I'm going to run the server and then run the test suite to make sure everything is green, and then we can get started. So everything looks okay. Since this application is not that complicated, I'm going to start off by looking at the database YAML file. All the environment variables that this application needs to run are listed in this file. To get started, I'm going to create the Dockerfile, and I'm going to call it dockerfile.dev, because this is the Dockerfile for our development environment. We will pull an Alpine Linux image that has Ruby 2.66 pre-installed from Docker Hub. Double check your gem file or .ruby version to make sure you're getting the correct version of Ruby installed. Next, I'm going to set up an environment variable called app_path, and I'm going to set it to /var/app. Next, the bundle version that we will use. So to check which version of bundler was used to bundle this application, simply go into the gemfile.lock and search for bundled with. I'm going to copy paste that in, and I'm going to set the bundle path where the gems will be installed to user local bundle/gems. Next, the temporary file path will be /temp, and then Rails log to standard out will be true. The Rails port will be 3000, and all these environment variables will be passed to the app. Next, I'm going to copy the dev docker entry point.sh file to user local bin dev entry point.sh. I make a little typo here, but we'll fix that later. So let's go ahead and create this new file. This file will be copied to our Docker container and will run within the bash shell. So we make sure that this script actually exits if there's an error, and we will print the Rails environment to the console, and then we will check if the bundle dependencies are satisfied, and if not, we'll run bundle install. Next, the script will remove any existing PID file from a previous session, so in case your server crashes, the next time the container boots, it will automatically clear out the server PID. Next, it will prepend any command that is passed to this script with bundle exec. Let's jump back to the Docker file and then create the entry point for the test environment. So I'm going to copy the script for the test environment over to the containers user local bin test entry point shell file, and then we will create that new test Docker entry point. The setup here will be identical to the dev entry point, the only difference being that we won't clear out the server PID, because we won't be running a server in test mode. With the two entry points defined and copied to the Docker container, we need to make sure that they're executable. So here I'm going to use the change mode command and grant execution permissions for each of these files that we just copied over. With that in place, we can install the dependencies for Rails. As always, the code for this is in the description below along with step-by-step instructions. With the dependencies installed, I'm going to remove the cache for the APK package manager, and then go ahead and create the directory for the application inside the Docker container, and then use Ruby gems to install the bundler version we specified earlier. Now I'm going to remove the gem home, which is defined by Ruby gems, and then set the working directory to the app path. I'm going to expose the Rails port to the outside, and then set the entry point to pass bundle exec. So now that we have defined how to create the image for our application, it's time to set up the infrastructure that will support it. To do this, we will use Docker Compose and create the Docker Compose YAML file. Inside this file, we will write the definition for version 3 of Docker Compose. We will define two networks, test and development. And then for these, we will have volumes, and we will need a DB data volume, which will store the database. We will need a gem cache for the gems, and shared data that will be shared between all the images. For the services, we will need a database, and for this we will use the default Postgres 12 image that we will pull from Docker Hub, and we will just call it restaurant.db, and Docker will handle the DNS resolution for us automatically. And we'll point it to the DB data volume, and then shared data will be mapped to var shared. Here it will be on the networks for development and test. Since Postgres requires a username and a password, we will pass them as environment variables. We will define some port mapping, so this database will be accessible from the outside. So here I'm using port 5099 because I have a local version of Postgres already running. Next, I will create the definition for the actual application, and I'm going to call it rest your own app. And the build context will be the present working directory, and the Dockerfile will be the dockerfile.dev we just declared, and then the container name will be rest your own app. Here in the volumes, I'm going to set the bind mount for var app to the present directory in the local file system. With this bind mount in place, we can change the source code for our Rails application in the present directory, and it will map to the var app directory in the Docker container. Next, we map the shared folders along with the gem cache. The development environment will have access to the development network, and we will map port 3000 in the container to 3000 on the host. So the app will be available on localhost :3000. Next, we define two predicates for standard in open and TTY true. This enables us to debug the application with bybug. Next, we need to pass the environment variables, and to do that, we will just create a file called .env.development and then write all the variables in there. Next, we need to define the startup script. And remember, we copied dev-docker entrypoint.sh into the container and we renamed it. So it's going to be dev-entrypoint.sh. And we'll pass it the command rails s on port 3000, and we will bind it to the machine's IP address. We will pass a few environment variables here that are public, so things like the Rails environment, and we will say that it depends on the database. With the development environment configured, it's time to set up the test environment. So for this, I will go ahead and use the image from before. So Docker by default prefixes the directory name. So it will be restaurant app. The container name will be restaurant test. The volumes will be the same as before. It will bind mount the present directory to var app inside the container. The test app will be on its own network, and that network will be test. And we will map it to port 3001 on the host and 3000 inside the Docker container. The predicates will be the same as before, and we will specify a separate environment file for the test environment. We'll name it .env.test. The env file will be the same as development, but with a different database name. We will point the entry point to test entrypoint.sh, and the command won't be Rails server like before. It will just be Rails v, because we want this container to actually exit once it comes up. So we will just use it to run the test suite. Okay, that was a lot. Let's see if this works. And it doesn't. Docker configurations rarely work the first time. So let's see what's wrong. It looks like the files were in the wrong place, so I'm going to move it to the root of the project directory and move that file as well. All right. Let's give it another try. And there seems to be a few syntax errors. Let's go ahead and fix those. Okay, let's give it another try. And it looks like one of the files are misnamed. So let's see if that file exists. It doesn't. So it's right here. Let's fix that. There shouldn't be a dot, there should be a dash. So it should be docker entrypoint.sh. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, it's going further than before, and we have a different error. So it looks like one of the flags passed to APK was incorrect. So it's no dash cache. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, with the magic of hindsight, it's going to work this time. And great. So it asks if I want to continue and build this new image. I want to say yes. And all is well. So we see the test app exited with code 0. And if we go to port 3000, we see the application. Cool. No small feat. All done. So now you have Dockerized a Rails application. Let's see if we can actually debug it. I'm going to put a breakpoint right there with bybug. And I'm going to attach to the app. I'm going to refresh the page, and fair enough, it works. I can peek into the runtime. Okay, so now we know the app works in development. Let's see if the test suite runs. So I'm using a combination of RSpec and Minitest here, and all of it is wrapped up in a rake task. So I see an error, but everything seems to work. The database gets dropped, it gets created, and the test suite runs. So we see the error. It says command not found, CECL. So I made a typo. Let's go ahead and fix that. So it's bundle check, fix it and run it. So the error is still there. And this makes sense because we actually copied this shell script from the local directory to the Docker container. So in order to fix this, we need to go ahead and destroy the image and rebuild it from scratch. So let's do that really quickly and see if that helps. All right, so with the image removed, we're going to rebuild again and run the test suite. And we see there's no error. All is well. Okay, now that everything seems to work, let's see if the Rails generators are functional. So for this, I will use a docker run rm flag, which will spin up a container and then clean it up after the script runs. So for this, I'm just going to generate a post that has a body. And we see the standalone container is spun up, and the script runs and it exits. So that's good. So let's see if we can actually migrate the database. And looks like we can. Okay, with that in place, let's see if the Postgres container behaves as expected. To do this, I'm going to use the docker exec command, which will run a command and stay attached to the container. I'm going to run a Postgres console as the user Postgres as we defined in the configuration. And then I'm going to list the databases and we see everything works as expected. Okay, now that we know the infrastructure is sound, let's see if hot code reloading works. So to do this, I'm going to spin up the container and I'm going to change something on the home page. So I'm just going to say just an average dev shop. I'm going to go into the browser and we see the changes are reflected. I'm going to capitalize everything and it works. So this was a long one and I hope it was helpful. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.